You are listening to the Get Global podcast, a weekly journey into the international business landscape with leaders, knowers, and doers from around the world who share their stories and insights on the issues that matter most. Get Global brings you the best to help you thrive in foreign markets. So we are here with Joanna Young from Team One. Joanna, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Team One, what you do there, and the research that you've been conducting.
My name is Joanna Young. I'm a managing director of strategy at Team One. We're a full-service advertising agency and a division of Saatchi & Saatchi. We specialize in premium and luxury brands. And so one of the parts of my job is actually overseeing a thought leadership initiative at the agency that we call the Global Affluent Tribe. And it really is actually just a series of inquiries of what's going on in the world of the affluent and actually the aspirational. And really the kind of premise of all of this is to understand what people want moving forward as opposed to what they want today. There's a lot of agencies out there that talk about trend spotting, cool things that are going on today, and that's absolutely important. But really, a lot of kind of what I meditate on and think about and study and invest in is to see where the puck is going. What are people aspiring to? How are they defining their lives for tomorrow? Really for the benefit of our clients, who are the likes of Lexus, who we do across the U.S., as well as HSBC Premier, Ritz-Carlton, St. Regis. We have some video game business, et cetera, et cetera. And so across a lot of these kinds of categories, there is premium pricing and there's a lot of desire. There's sometimes not a reason why you might be paying that kind of premium other than the fact that you want it. And so really a lot of this is to try to understand why people want the things that they do.
So what was the genesis of this research and inquiry into the global affluent category? Where does this come from and why?
So I wasn't there for the genesis, but there's a couple of good stories, so I'll tell you one of my favorites. So right after the economic crisis, and we've been in existence for 30 plus years, so this is something that we've been doing, but kind of at that moment in time, post-economic crisis, there was a bit of a hangover. There was a lot of people that lost money. And those who had it were actually feeling really guilty about it. They didn't really want to even show it off. And so, things like consumption of luxury goods, travel was much lower than it was before. And right at that point, one of our clients, who's a luxury hotel brand, was actually going into new markets, very, very strong brand in the US, but they were looking into secondary, tertiary markets in China. They were looking at places in the United Arab Emirates, et cetera, places where maybe people didn't know who they were. And again, travel is down. They're actually making lucrative investments and long-term investments in these kinds of markets. And what they were seeing across the board with some of their competitors were there was a bit of an amenities war. So, people were investing in things like pillow menus. You can have 13 different kinds of pillows, feathers, I can't even, explain. And so, of course, there were people within the organization that said, well, if they have 13 pillows, then we need to have 14. And if we're going into China, then maybe we need a different marketing campaign and a different message than we have in the US, which has to be different than the one that we have, in other parts of the world. And of course, diminishing marketing spend across the board. And so with all of that being said, there were strategists within the group that said, maybe there is something that connects the world's affluent rather than divides. Is there an emerging value system that we can actually tap into so that we're having one unified message rather than multiple ones, in which case you're slicing and dicing your advertising budget, your efforts, the kind of manpower that you have to employ. And so what we did was actually identify what we were calling emerging values of the affluent. And so just kind of taking a step back for a second, there's a lot of cliches out there of what people think about when you say an affluent person, and I actually really love asking that question. And there's a lot of French accents and guys who are going to the opera, or, you have like these kinds of like caricatures that people have, right? But if you think about the fact that 73 out of the top 100 wealthiest people in the world did not inherit that wealth, 2 out of 3 billionaires are self-made, so they're first generation wealthy, affluent folk, they have a very, very different kind of context and a different kind of upbringing than what you would imagine, again, back to kind of the cliches of what affluence is about. And so, I was just chatting with Abraham about the fact that HSBC Premier was one of my clients. And, as we were looking at kind of servicing that we were trying to do on a brand level, Standard Chartered, which is another, major bank out of Hong Kong, actually had just started employing an art curator on their staff. Why do you need an art curator if you're a bank? Well, there's a lot of wealthy people who have a lot of money who have never collected art before, who are using Standard Chartered to wire the funds when they were going to these auctions and they didn't know what art to buy. And so as the bank of choice, they were able to offer this as an added value service to this emerging affluent class and in a way differentiate themselves by acting not as a bank, but as kind of a solution provider to their clients because they really got insight into who they were. And so it's things like that we were really starting to see. So can I keep talking or do you want me to stop and...
Sure. I think one of the things that I'm hearing you talk about also is that it sort of comes at the global versus local issue. You want to find the things that unite rather than the things that differentiate, where I think a lot of people look at what differentiates and try to get them on that.
Yep.
So talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So we identified 5 values of what I was calling kind of emerging modern affluence kind of perceptions. So I'll kind of just go through them and illustrate them because I think it's really helpful. One was around mobility. And so that was really a value, and so at its kind of most simplistic, it's travel. But if you think about mobility in terms of social mobility as well as geographic mobility, one of my favorite statistics in the world is that before capitalism happened, so we're talking, 1800s, the average human being had not traveled more than 3 miles away from their place of birth, and then now you think about your Instagram feed, it's a bit of a different world that we're living in. And so, back in the day, what was prioritized was actually portability, the fact that you can afford a plane ticket to go somewhere or get on the Titanic. And now actually travel is much more of a canvas for exploration and personal growth. And so it's as much actually kind of like the canvas to say, I'm deciding to go to Costa Rica or I go to Paris or what have you. Those things say as much about you as the bag that you're carrying or the, place that you go to cut your hair. And so it's a very different kind of currency that people are working with when you're talking about mobility. Same thing for second value, which is status. Before it was very much about badge, and I'm not even just talking about Louis Vuitton, which, you had mentioned earlier. It's even things like, where you went to school or, what kind of profession that you have. And what we were seeing with the affluent was that they were starting to acknowledge and realize that, status comes in very different terms, and we had a lot of people who would agree with statements such as, I'm continuing to redefine success for myself on a daily basis. So it's not just that once I get my law degree or once I get that house at the right address that I've succeeded. There's not this kind of resting on the laurels anymore. Another value was around belonging. And before it was very much about a red velvet rope and I was on one side and, you were on the other. And we talked about it yesterday, actually, in terms of Brazil. There's a lot of that kind of behavior, but that's actually across the world. And so, and now it's actually much more inclusive. It's much more based on passions as opposed to your point of origin. And so, for instance, one of my favorite illustrations of this is, 2 people meet at an airport lounge. And back in the day when they're sizing each other up, they would probably say something about, oh, my family used to vacation in Cannes or Hilton Head. My father's part of such and such country club. And today, actually, it's much more things like, oh, I'm a passionate windsurfer. Oh, I've been to Arenal. Oh, my gosh, then you must go to Tarifa. And all of a sudden, you're thick as thieves and you're inviting each other over to, your summer houses. And so there is this kind of much more inclusivity and much more passion-based kind of community and tribe forming that people are having, which is very different than the past. Another value that we looked at was consumption. And so, if you think about kind of the 80s, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, it's really no longer about opulence or ostentatiousness anymore. It's very much about meaningful consumption. And sometimes it's actually unconsumption, which is kind of what's interesting. So a lot of brands, of course, coming to talk about, their ethics or the kind of, do-gooding kind of initiatives that they have. But, it's funny because at its kind of most consumption-ness of it, I was recently in a focus group with very wealthy New Yorkers. And one woman said, it's not that I spend less money, but I actually spend it differently than I did in the past. And so she told this great story about how every year she would go to Saks and purchase 3 cashmere sweaters. It was kind of like a ritual every single October. And, she would pay $500 for it. She would wear it. And then, at the end of the season, she would donate it to her Goodwill because these sweaters were no longer good. And at this point, I always say, where does she donate her goods? Because I really need to go to that Goodwill. But, and she never told me. But, but this year she bought 1 sweater instead of 3. She didn't have much closet space anyway. And she actually spent $2,000 on that sweater instead of the $500. But at the end of the season, I know, life is hard. Life is really hard. But, at the end of the season, she said she could keep the sweater and she's going to wear it again next year. So she said, I'm going to just start buying 1 a year instead of the 3. And so in some ways, it says a lot just about the kind of discerning level of discernment that this class has, but also just a need for more significance in the kinds of purchases that they're making. And so, as marketers or brands or solution providers to this class, there's a very different kind of set of ethics and needs and aspirations that this group is looking for. And again, it's very different than what I think a lot of people who are not living this life understand it to be. So at the biggest point, what we were realizing, and we've called our initiative the Global Affluent Tribe. And the reason that we do that is because this group actually has a lot of tribal characteristics. English is kind of the national language of this tribe. 95% of this group speak it. Most of them work in either multinational companies or are Western educated, or at the very least are consuming media that are very English based. There is a success ladder. It very much has to do with hard work and education. It's no longer about who you know necessarily, or the fact that you've been born into this kind of money. And so again, if we're speaking in those kinds of old luxury codes, then we're actually missing a lot of the relevance that we could be having. And so just to kind of give an example of that is actually, for me, the cereal industry. Very different from luxury. But for a very long time, they were kind of selling this idea of mom and dad and breakfast with the fruit on the table, and everybody eats before the kids go off to school every single morning. And, I've been in focus groups and moms will say, the truth is, Diet Coke and a granola bar, and he's in the back seat, and I can barely get him to class on a daily basis in time. And so, as every single cereal company out there, if you want to deal in nostalgia in this kind of 1950s romantic sense of what family and breakfast is, that's fantastic. But that's not what modern life is anymore. And so, if you want to be about modern relevance, then that industry has to completely shift and think about that mom who's feeling like a bad mother, but feeding the kid the Diet Coke and the granola bar. And similarly for, luxury and affluence, we need to understand what their lives are like and what they're aspiring to, because it's no longer the kinds of images that I think people have had in media and in culture and the things that we've been growing up with.
What are some more of these images? So if it's not about nostalgia, what is the good life today for the global affluent?
It's kind of interesting. I was really kind of asking that question, with the latest study, actually. We do a quantitative study across the world. It's now 15 countries. It's about 5,000 people that we speak with, 11 languages. But we also do qualitative work. We do semiotic studies. So there's kind of a broad reach of things that my group does. But, one of my questions actually starting from last year was, what is this good life? I was in Singapore seeing some friends, and they lived in a high rise. They had 2 bedrooms and 1 for the live-in housekeeper. And this was the prime of their lives. And, their currency was actually, what floor are you on? Are you on 101 or are you on 50? Because that's at everything, and that's very different than thinking about 2-car garages and white picket fences or, whatever that kind of nostalgia of what, Hollywood has been feeding us as well. Mm-hmm. And so I came back and I was actually talking to a colleague of mine who's Indian and actually Goan, funny enough, and, part Portuguese and has a very eclectic kind of upbringing as well. And he said, that's so funny that you say that, because one of my best friends has a teenage daughter and she says her influence is Bollywood and goth. So no Katy Perry, there's no Kardashians in there. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And so we started asking questions, and we did it in a lot of different ways, just because I was trying to figure out, like, what is this kind of, it's not an American dream, it's not a global dream, but it's fulfillment and aspiration. And, what's fascinating about it is that when it came down to it came down to health, of course, but also happiness, time with my loved ones, my significant other, my spouse, but also my children. And then opportunity was the big thing. So opportunity in terms of moments for self-development, moments to grow, but also things like 87% of the world that we surveyed, these affluents in these 15 countries, said that they had a bucket list, if you can imagine that. And on average, there were 6 things on their bucket list. And so, to me, what that says is basically that there's a lot of kind of growth that they want to do and the kinds of things that they want to experience. Number one thing on the bucket list was travel the world, and that was at 60%. And then it's teetered off to things like, of course, write a book or, go on a spiritual journey or, do something very specific like, go see the ballet in Moscow, for instance, was something that, people would say things like that. But again, it goes back to just opportunity for growth and spending time with the people that we care about. The other thing that I will say about that is that, they understand that they have one life to live. So 3 out of 4 will say, I want to use my wealth to basically eke out as much as possible, experience the best of life. But what's, again, interesting about that versus even 2010 when people were not wanting to purchase things is that now they're seeing their wealth as a means to the things that they're looking for. So for instance, I have money, so therefore I can spend quality time with my family. I can stay at a great place and actually not just bring my immediate family, but also, friends, for instance. So it's not exactly altruism per se, but there is almost like a higher purpose for the way that they're spending their money. And then the other interesting thing about it is that the number one hashtag that a lot of wealthy people use, and we keep seeing it in our social listening, is blessed. They feel blessed and they understand that they are hashtag blessed. Yeah. They understand that their life is privileged, but they definitely want to be able to experience as much as possible.
So there's a part of this that's a little bit like affluent. They're just like us. They want the simple things. So what is it that distinguishes their set of basic desires? And it makes sense. The heart's a simple thing, I think. The brain is complicated, but I think the heart has a simple message in the things that it wants. So what distinguishes their set of simple things versus the character or tone or substance of the non-affluent?
I think it's as basic as they don't have to worry about the base of the pyramid of the Maslow hierarchy. And so when, we ask them things about what do you want to be known for? What do you hope for your children? And we actually surveyed the bottom 90% and we look at it, versus the top 10 and the top 5%, and we'll cut the data. And what you see actually is that the wealthiest talk about happiness, number one. And then they talk about things like fulfillment. Like I said, when you talk about, when you ask them about what are you looking for in a partner, like a romantic partner, the number one thing, 69%, is compassionate. And then it goes to sense of humor. And things like coming from a good family is way down on the list. I think it was 9%, right there with fame, which is something like 7%. When you look at the 90%, they're similar, but they won't be as profound. So, for instance, if someone in what we're calling our Global Affluent Tribe will say that they want happiness or self-development is really important, we'll see that at about 95% agreement at that top level, and then we'll see it at about 85 or 75% at the next level. And so what we're seeing is that the trend is going that way, but those that don't have as much don't have the kind of room to be able to indulge in that kind of way, if you will. And we see it again with the things that they're hoping for with their children. At the highest level, it's education and opportunity. At the lowest level, you start seeing things like health come up, and status and success actually start becoming more important. I hope for my children to be respected is something that we'll see at the 90% level. We don't see it at that top 5 or top 1% because they already have it. And so we did this fun thing, and it was kind of interesting because we asked them a series of questions about how important is it that you're happy, how important is it that you're successful, how important is it that you feel loved. We kind of, there was 3 or 4 things that we had asked. And then we said, how do you feel right now? And what was really interesting was that things like successful were at dead equal. And so what that means is that 71% of people said it's important to feel successful. 71% of people said that they felt successful. So there was no gap. But when you get into things like stress or happiness, there was a gap. And what they said that they admired was when you were spending more time with your family, with your friends and your loved ones. And so I think part of the premise actually is that these people are incredibly successful. They spend a lot of time doing the things that they're doing, accomplishments, getting the degrees that they're doing, running the businesses that they're running. And so what they're aspiring to is actually the things beyond that. And so what they want is really the things that they're not able to spend most of their time with, which, essentially becomes, spending time for themselves in the ways that are most important.
So how do we apply this research? What are some really interesting ways that you've seen this out in the world? The things that what happens when it hits the market in really clever ways?
So a couple of things that we've done very kind of tactically and happy to talk more about any examples. But one was thinking about how we could add value to these people's lives rather than just sell at them, And one thing that I saw was that, for instance, what's your favorite place and way to connect with people that you care about? And the number one answer was dinner. That was at 67%. And versus something like happy hour, which is at, I think it was 34 or 35%. So that we all like to weekend getaways came up a lot. I think it was at about 46%. So people really, what's happening again is also they don't really need to widen their circle. It's very much about quality over quantity. And so with the people that they care about, I'm going to put my phone down, I'm going to have a glass of wine and have dinner with you, but actually commit to you, and that gift of time is actually the most important and the biggest gift that an affluent person can give to another person, because that's the one resource that they can't actually increase, no matter how much success and money and all of that they have. And so, just thinking about it from a travel standpoint, for instance, because we do have hotel clients, what we talked about was rather than talking about the romantic weekend getaway, which frankly, who really does that? Especially, I have 2 kids, so maybe it's just not going to happen for a while. My 5-month-old has to find his own room at some point. But we said, well, there's a lot of weekend getaways that are happening where it's much more about friends, and it's a much bigger group, and it's much more inclusive, and it's also much more porous in the sense that you have 10 friends that you want to travel with. Not all 10 have to go, maybe it's a matter of there's a great deal and 6 out of 10 can go. And so therefore we're just going to go, next time we'll catch you again, because travel is happening so much more frequently anyway. And so, the implications of that are, what are the kinds of packages that we could create? And we've even gone so far as to say to our client, is there a 1-800 number so that everybody could stay in the same floor on a hotel? Because how you book a room and your parents are on one floor and you're on the other and your kids are on the others. Is there a way that we can actually fix those kinds of problems? So just on a very practical level. Another just example, go ahead.
I was going to ask, how sensitive is this group to deals and incentives like that? And what's the thinking behind it?
So I think that they are much more deal savvy than I think people would like to think, and in some ways, actually, they get moved by deals and they get moved by brands. And so there is this kind of difference between things that are worth it versus things that are affordable or a good deal. And they'll kind of be promiscuous, actually. They'll go back and forth on it. So for instance, they might spend $10,000 a person on a yacht trip that's a once-in-a-lifetime honeymoon or, a romantic, celebration. And they will also, take the quickie trip where, tickets are just $500, so we just went to Venice for the weekend, and anecdotally, we do hear stories like that. And so it's much more about just, again, consumption for the quality of the meaning of the experience. It's not necessarily about the money. And so, you can move them based on the deal, but you're not always going to move them based on the deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So one more question. What has been the biggest surprise to you along the way in doing this whole study? managing this research and, talking to folks and learning all of this?
Gosh. I think probably the most interesting thing was how mundane some of our aspirations are, and so we asked them about social media and we said, what are you posting? And it's literally things that I'm eating, my weekend pictures with my kids or vacation. And nobody's out there really saying I want to be an Instagram star and that's why I'm doing these things. But then what we were realizing is that there's kind of almost like an affluent diaspora that's going on in the world, and so if you think about a lot of countries where, there's the capital and then there's kind of everything else. And so if you want to be successful, then you actually have to move to, wherever it is that is the center of commerce and opportunity. And so a majority of our panels said that they actually don't live in the same city as their parents or their siblings or their close friends. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually kind of like a mass migration. And I, jokingly, I think I said this to you when we met, I was in Lyon last year for vacation. It's just the third largest city in France. The second largest is Marseille. And I'd never really thought about it. And I'm quite a Francophile, but nobody ever says I'm going to grow up and move to Marseille for the opportunity. So, in that kind of same way, people are migrating to Manila and to Singapore, just that there is the kind of a reality. And so how do you stay close to the people that you care about? It's through Instagram. That's how you're telling your mom that, you actually ate a healthy lunch, and there is this kind of like intimacy in these kinds of new emerging technology ways. WhatsApp, we talked about that earlier as well, but it's really to get closer and have deeper quality connections with the people that they care about. And to me, that's just fascinating because that's, that doesn't seem like an affluent problem, but it is just as much for them as it is for anybody else. And even so, more so perhaps just because a lot of them have left their hometowns and what's familiar to really be the modern pioneers.
Joanna, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our events and get more global intel every week, sign up for our newsletter at getglobal.co.